government, for the first time ever, the government of Japan, the Meteorological Association issued a warning that they expect a large earthquake fairly soon, meaning like in the, people are interpreting that to mean like in the seven range, maybe 7 to 8 range. And that's huge. And they've never said that before, that they're expecting one soon. And you can't predict earthquakes, right? And so generally you can't predict them, but they actually are predicting one that's coming soon. And it was such a serious warning that the prime minister was going to go on an overseas trip, and he canceled his trip just in case it happened. And so last night I ordered a bunch of water and a gas cooker and a bunch of ramen, in case it's necessary, because um, if a big earthquake happened in Japan, um, there have been some earthquakes here that, um, the building structures are better now, and the damage in Tohoku, it wasn't from the earthquake, it was from the tsunami. Um, but um, Tokyo is pretty low, and then Tokyo has a bay too. And so a bay is a very big protector against tsunami, um, but it's never been like this before, where the country has been told by the officials that a large earthquake could be coming soon. And um, I also saw uh, a video of a plane in Brazil that crashed yesterday, and it had like 62 people on it, and it was a passenger plane, and they had video of the plane just spinning around like this and falling down into the ground. And I sort of felt like that image, it captured the feeling of a lot of people and the experience of a lot of people. um, whether there's like personal trials that are going on, or whether there are, there are political things, or um, just and even what will happen in the United States. It's really not clear to anyone, I think, about what's going to happen. One side in the is saying that it's all just fluff and sugar and high, and it's all going to go away, and that Trump is definitely ahead in the most important states. Maybe there's few states that are more closely contested now. And then other people are saying like, oh, this momentum, and either thing could happen. But it just, um, for people who have this perspective, and this is just a opinion or my perspective, but that Kamala Harris is probably the most unqualified person to ever have been considered to be president of the United States, and she's now the candidate who she may win. And um, it's just such a different future if she were to win. And um, it's all these things. They're just like how Brother Iqbal is describing it. Bangladesh, it feels like Syria, and like things go from just being remote and seeing them in the news to now all of a sudden many people are facing these things. Even in Japan, which feels like the safest country in the world, it's more clear that it's just resting on the top of a very fragile foundation, and everything can just crash down. Everything depends on electricity, and electricity can crash down, and nuclear power plants and all of this stuff, and the whole society can just crash down. And I was just, had an experience yesterday. I was talking to some people, and I realized how strong the feeling in some people in Japan is of even if they're falling behind economically, even if, they're being left behind in technology, even, but they're still comfortable because of the way of life and everything. And um there's this very, very strong sense of, just like in America, how it is with materialism. There's something else in Japan, and it's just this very strong, and I felt the power of that yesterday, which I hadn't felt for a long time. And I just felt like, wow, that is actually a very strong power of things not wanting to change here. And I was just kind of stopped by it. You know what I mean? Like I was just sort of stopped by it. And then, but when I was sitting in the cafe last night and then the earthquake happened, it was genuinely scary, and everyone in the cafe was scared. And then I felt like, oh yeah, but that confidence, that comfortableness, it's not real. um and all of this is going on in the world. And but I wanted but I was talking to Flora last night about what would it be like to be in the same room as Jesus. And and she said, "Oh, it's an interesting question." And in a way, it's kind of like the only question that is above every other question that we're asking. Um, because in heaven, we'll be in that place. It will essentially, heaven will be like we are in the same room as Jesus, in terms of our picturing it right now. Um, because of course, it's very, very hard to picture heaven. We have little glimpses of it. Um, and but I personally feel like it's been very valuable for me to spend a part of my day basically doing that, trying to just picture what would it be like to be in the same room as Jesus, and to try and picture the reality of heaven. Because I think there's just something about, with the deterioration of the earth and the upheaval, like Dev said, about you can't row two boats, right? And so one boat is obviously sinking. The boat of the world is sinking, and it's going to sink. And the boat of the world has already hit that, whatever, disaster. And the other boat, though, is going to row all the way up to heaven, and that's the boat that we ought to be in. And if the boat that we're going to be in is going to heaven, then it's really making a lot of sense for us to start focusing and directing our attention on, even, on something we can't picture. And I was late because Joseph is trying to help his friend who just lost his job, and I was just talking to Joseph about it right before service. And we're talking about Japanese university students, and if you ask some people, they'll say Japanese university students are not interested in meeting foreigners, but that's actually not true. My experience, and I think I probably talked to hundreds of Japanese university students, they're very interested in meeting foreigners. And maybe that's just because I'm talking to them. So that's the group of people that I would tend to meet, right? It's skewed based on that, but it's still fairly accurate. Um, it's not that they don't want to meet international people or have international friends, but it's more that they're afraid to, and they're afraid to speak, and afraid to something like that. And so in a sense, I recognize that it's the same for me with respect to God. It's not that I don't want to know God, and for many people, it's that I'm afraid to know God, and I have this fear of relationship with God, that the reason I don't sit and concentrate for long periods of time on what would it be like to be in the same room as Jesus, it's not because I don't want to know him, but it's actually I'm afraid to know him. And so being able to recognize those two things, that fear and desire are separate, And in order, and don't combine them together and come up with one result, one sum, one answer. Because if you combine fear and desire together and you get an output, that output's going to be much smaller than the reality. But if you recognize that desire is like this and fear is like this, then the end result, if you combine them together, is going to be desire seems like it's only this big, right? If desire is this big and then fear is almost as big, the net result is that desire is going to seem like it's only this big. But if you separate those things out and you recognize, okay, desire is like this, fear is like this, eliminate the fear, and then the desire, the true level of desire would then be apparent. And that's the desire that we need to act on when it comes to knowing God. And we ought to not have fear. And so the reason that a lot of people also don't want to believe in God is because they don't want God to exist. It's like in Romans, and it just is very clear to a lot of people, God probably does exist. But there's another force at work where we don't want God to exist because we're afraid to be punished by him, or we're afraid to be rejected by him, or there's fear of relationship. And so separating those two things out, recognition or desire that God exists or wanting to know him, with fear, because the fear has been taken away. The fear is an irrational fear. And we're told in a reliable way, the fear can be cast out with love. And so that helped me to decide how to spend more of my time. I'm going to spend my time focusing on just knowing God and sitting there doing my best to struggle through the resistance of my flesh and to concentrate on those little tiny glimpses where the flesh is subsiding and going down enough so that the spiritual can kind of peek through. And it actually takes work. It takes me like an hour a day of just sitting there looking out the window to get to where anything productive happens. But I would say that that hour is the most important hour of my day. And if I don't spend that hour just looking out the window, I feel like I've wasted the day. Um, and so here is something that this is in Hebrews, and it's not totally the exact same thing, but it's in Hebrews chapter 12, and it's from verse 19 or 18. For you have not come to the mountain that may be touched and burned with fire, and to blackness and darkness and tempest and the sound of a trumpet and the voice of words, so that those who heard it begged that the word should not be spoken to them any more, for they could not endure what was commanded. And if so much as a beast touches the mountain, it shall be stoned or shot with an arrow. And so terrifying was the sight that Moses said, I am exceedingly afraid and trembling. So this is the contrast. This is the mountain that first existed where Moses approached God. And this is a terrifying mountain that if a beast, should touch it. This is the ark that, when it was wrongly touched, that it resulted in death. This is the mountain of God's grandeur and his awesomeness and his might and his power and the fear of God and the judgment of God. And this part of our image of God exists within us because it's true. God is all of those things. And we ought to revere him and treat him as holy. But then it says in verse 22, but you have come to Mount Zion and to the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem, and we are welcome into the heavenly Jerusalem. It is created and that we would be welcomed into it. It is not necessarily clear that it's for us specifically. It just may exist, but it exists, and that we exist, and that we're welcomed into it, and that it's presented to us. And so this heavenly Jerusalem, to an innumerable company of angels, we will enter into the company, an innumerable company of angels, angels that cannot be numbered. We will enter in to the presence of those angels. And we will stand before angels, and actually we are said to judge angels. And that, you know, I don't know if any of you have ever seen an angel. Um, and some people have seen angels. And I've had some interesting experiences where, that issue came about. Um, and it's very hard to conceive of. But that's the world that we're talking about, is this world that's very difficult for us to think about and very difficult for us to understand. But just as Bangladesh is becoming like Syria, and Japan is on the edge of this disaster, the entire world is on the edge of collapsing and disappearing. And it is going to be revealing this Mount Zion and this heavenly Jerusalem, or the opposite of it. And that's another thing that I think about during this period of time. I try to really picture what would it be like for me to be in hell, even though I know I'm not going there, but I try to picture it until it's real to me, of what would it be like for me to be in hell. And that gives me an appreciation of the cross. And then after I picture what would it be like for me to be in hell, and I can really, get some actual sense of it, where it's not just a conceptual, and then I asked Jesus, save me by your cross, forgive me for my sins, remove the corruption out of me. And there are these truths that require in the focused meditation for them to be real. And it says, you have not come to this other mountain, but you have come to Mount Zion and to the city of the living God, to the heavenly Jerusalem, to an innumerable company of angels, to the general assembly and church of the firstborn who are registered in heaven. And we will all be registered in heaven, and we will be entering into this church of the firstborn, to God, the judge of all, to the spirits of just men made perfect. That's us. Our spirits are going to be made perfect. And so that's part of heaven. It's not just that we're in a perfect place, but that our spirits will be made perfect. And that's hard to imagine too, but that's also part of God's promise. And so it's not like, I don't belong in heaven, and so I can't imagine heaven. We have to also recognize that in God's plan, we are not just going to enter a perfect place, but we're going to be made perfect. And like how in a love story or something, the more virtuous a person is, the greater the love story is. And so, like a very virtuous person falling in love, that love means so much more. It's the same thing with heaven, that our virtue and our nature is going to be made perfect. And so we're going to be able to experience heaven as a perfect person. That all of that is going to change. And so the spirits of just men made perfect, to Jesus, the mediator of the new covenant. And so that's also that we're going to be approaching Jesus, and we're not going to have to be afraid, because we can approach him because of the blood of the cross and the new covenant. And this is what is emerging as this world is starting to crumble and starting to be torn apart. And even as evil, it will be like hell will open up, and evil spirits will rise up out of hell, and populate the earth and do all of these things. And super evil is going to become normal to a lot of people. And really gross, terrible things are going to happen that have never happened before. But if we're focused on the boat that we're supposed to be on and where that boat is going, those things won't even be a distraction. They're going to be a propulsion. And that's the reason to focus on heaven, is so that as evil rises, our hearts do not grow cold. As evil rises and chaos increases, our hearts do not become confused or bitter, but instead it propels us. And sometimes, when I've had very difficult things happen to me, sometimes they hurt me and they discourage me. But then if I'm able to overcome them somehow by God giving me faith through grace, those things actually become propulsion to me. And they sharpen my desire for what's righteous and holy and make me willing to sacrifice and become determined. And so that focus on heaven results in us being propelled toward God by evil instead of discouraged.